Hello everybody and welcome to this episode of Activist Lawyer. Today I'm joined in the studio by Siobhán Conlon of Siobhán Conlon Solicitors in Dublin. So welcome to the studio, Siobhán.
Thanks a million. It's good to be back in Uri.
Oh, back in Uri. You've been here a few times then.
I have indeed, yeah.
Oh, great. So thanks for making the effort to join us here in our lovely studio today. Just a little bit of background on Siobhán. So Siobhán is a human rights lawyer specialising in immigration, asylum and criminal defence law. Siobhán has a master's in international criminal law and gained experience in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague. Siobhán qualified as a New York attorney in 2005 and is a member of the Law Society in Ireland. She formerly worked for a top-tier corporate law firm before specialising in representing the most vulnerable in society. Siobhán recently retired from the board of directors of specialising, Ireland's National Centre for Survivors of Torture, a great organisation. So Siobhán, thanks again for joining us. You might take us back a little bit in time just to tell us, well, why law? First of all, what made you get into this area of practice?
I think I probably always knew if I was going to do law, going to be a lawyer, that I'd end up working where I am now, human rights law, representing vulnerable people. I suppose growing up in my house, social justice, would have been a big theme. Politics would have been discussed. Mm-hmm. And as I think Sarah mentioned before, I have relatives, my aunt and uncle, cousins living in South Armagh. So as a kid, I would have been up and down to visit them at weekends, So being in South Armagh in the 80s and 90s, mm-hmm. very different place mm-hmm. than it is today. And so as a kid, just an outsider looking in, I suppose that kind of opened my eyes to the world, really. It would have been a highly militarised place at that time. And, overhearing, earwigging probably, conversations that adults would have about what was going on at the time, the politics, sure. And just maybe the sheer injustice of it all. And I think that probably just seeped into the subconscious and probably had a bit of an influence on me. And later on, I think, when I finished with the corporate law and was thinking, what'll I do next? I remember reading Michael Mansfield's book, Memoirs of a Radical Lawyer, I think mm-hmm. it was called, and just being really impressed and inspired by his work and his work with Gareth Pearce and representing the Birmingham Six and, the miners and other people at a time when I'm sure it wasn't easy for them, mm-hmm. In the UK doing the work that they did. I'm sure they weren't really looked upon maybe even by their peers fondly. And just been really inspired and impressed by that. So I think that probably was what led me into studying law. Uh-huh. And after school, I went and went to UCD and did B&L. And I think probably doing B&L, business and legal, we were kind of funneled into a corporate law sure. environment. And I don't really remember there being kind of a choice or, having human rights or even criminal defence, that being kind of an option. It just mm-hmm. didn't seem to be available. So when I finished in UCD, I did the New York bar. So I sat the New York bar and myself and a friend went off to New York for a few months and quickly figured out it's very difficult to get a job and a visa, in New York. So we came home. And I ended up working in one of the bigger accountancy firms in their regulatory section, and I studied at night for the qualified lawyer transfer test, I think it was called at the time. It was sort of like the FE1s type exams, and once you did those, you could qualify as a solicitor in the South, in Ireland. And so I qualified and then got a job in one of the big corporate firms as a solicitor, and really just, I think, early on thought, I'm not sure this is really why I became a lawyer. This isn't really for me. I just didn't have the interest in the subject sure. matter and the clients. Yeah. And so I packed that in after a year or so and went travelling for a year. And I think that was probably the best thing mm-hmm. I could have done. It just really opened my eyes to the world, just gave me a different perspective on what was out there and even the different types of law that I could do. And in Sydney, I worked in a medical defence organisation for a while and eventually came home. But as I was kind of coming home, travelling, the recession hit Ireland. So when I left, things were great. when I was away, things were suddenly very, very grim, and the calls from home were kind of, you know, you're not going to get a job. This is not a great place to be. So I decided it was a good time to go back and sort of retrain, and I went to Galway, to the Irish Centre for Human Rights in the University of Galway, and studied a master's specialising in international criminal law. So it was a human rights master's, but my kind of specialisation was international criminal law. And that kind of led me to The Hague, to the ICTY. So I was there for a bit of time. Actually, when I got there, the particular case I was working on, it was at judgment drafting stage. So the trial had actually finished.
Okay.
And I was working in chambers it was a 3-judge chamber, just helping out with the judgment drafting process. So it was, an interesting case. Gotovina et al. was what it was called. It was a Croatian prosecution, 3 defendants, and all of whom ended up being acquitted.
Right.
Yeah, which was unusual for the ICTY and for international criminal law generally. So one was acquitted at trial, after the trial, and 2 then on appeal. Interesting time. And after that, I came back to Dublin, and I really wanted to get some experience advocating, you know, being in court on my feet, advocating. So I approached one of the criminal defence firms in Dublin and just kind of said, you know, will you let me come in for a few weeks and see what this is like? You know, just to get a feel for, is this what I want to do? Am I any good at it? So I ended up staying there for longer than I thought. Absolutely loved it.
Did you?
Loved being in court. Just loved my colleagues, the clients, everything about it, the law. And so decided to, at that point, set up my own practice. So that was, I know.
That's a big step.
It was a bit of a jump, like in retrospect. I'm not sure what I was thinking really, but again, I think it was at a time when there wasn't much happening. So it may have been a good time to do it.
Probably,
you know, if the big firms were calling with their big salaries, you know, you could be led another way. But I think it probably all just happened at a good time. And so, and so for the first few years, criminal defence was my main thing, and I built up a bit of a practice there. And then joined the panel, the Free Legal Aid panel for representation of international protection applicants.
Okay.
And that was kind of my introduction into immigration law. And that the practice just went from there and built from there. And now I would say, you know, I'm probably 80% immigration, asylum, and related judicial review and that kind of area, maybe 20% criminal defence. So it kind of did a full, you know, 190. Yeah.
So interesting. So, and just with your cases as well, I mean, you're obviously working with very vulnerable people, and we had mentioned children as well. What type of cases are, I suppose, on your desk now, or what really stands out in terms of your work at the moment?
Yeah, I think, you know, the last 6 months or a year, my big concern maybe, and the cases that come before me that maybe need the most priority are, as you say, children in the international protection process.
Okay. Are these unaccompanied minors usually? Or?
So I don't think private practitioners get referred unaccompanied minors, but what happens is if a child comes into the state and makes an application for asylum and has a birth date that says they're a child, they're assessed by TUSLA, the Child and Family Agency, and they'll give like an age determination assessment if the child doesn't have, you know, a valid passport or some ID document to sort of categorically prove their age. And if TUSLA assess them and say, look, we don't believe you're a child, then that child is put into the adult process, and so may end up on my desk, you know, as an adult applicant. But in fact, when the child comes in to see me, they're saying, well, no, I'm a child. And I went to school until this age, and my parents were killed and I had to leave, or, you know, whatever the case may be. And that's procedurally difficult to deal with, because TUSLA will say they won't reassess the child unless you can provide some documentary evidence for the purpose of a reassessment. And, you know, it's been the case that even if, I think maybe with TUSLA, with capacity issues in the last 6 months, I think they've been well documented. It's been in the newspapers, there have been reports about it. That even if we can put forward maybe evidence or request a reassessment, that it just isn't happening.
Sure.
And, really, really vulnerable children. Like, I can't really imagine anyone more vulnerable than, a child in the state with no parents, no social worker, nobody. If they go missing, well, who's to know they're gone missing?
Yeah. Well, that's a problem here too. And then do they become like aged out potentially if, say, that takes a long time for Tisler, or it's not really moving along as fast as you would like it to?
What has happened is we have taken cases, by way of judicial review in respect of it, and that creates another issue because they don't have an ex-friend. So they're a child, but they don't have somebody to initiate proceedings on their behalf, which is required.
Because the state can't if they've determined that they're an adult. Yeah.
Exactly, because they don't have a parent, because they're an unaccompanied minor. They don't have family generally, because they're an asylum seeker, and they don't have a social worker because TUSL have said they don't, essentially believes that they are a child.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's been the case for me that I've ended up being an ex-friend as a solicitor, which isn't usually allowed. It's not appropriate, I suppose. It could be seen in certain circumstances as a conflict of interest, but for this particular circumstance, it's not. And you will be able to bring a case. Okay. But again, as a solicitor, that's not an ideal situation, and I can't imagine any other area of law where you are acting as an ex-friend, essentially bringing proceedings and all that goes with that, the liability and everything else. And I don't think that would be an issue, but it still just highlights the total vulnerability of these kids. Even their access to the courts is difficult. So yeah, that's one sort of area that has difficult. Been difficult and on my desk in the last while. The other one would be homeless asylum seekers. So that's been a big,
getting a lot of press at the moment.
Totally
figures. It's actually quite shocking. I think the Irish Refugee Council released a report this year just saying, I have a little bit of it here, just that it's an absolute crisis of accommodation for anyone seeking international protection in Ireland, and they describe it as a loss of dignity and destitution among those forced. And you've seen it. I mean, I've seen the press covering it quite recently, so that must be a huge problem.
Yeah, and I think, like, from a legal perspective, as lawyers, we can take cases, to the High Court. The state have certain obligations under EU law to provide material reception conditions, and we can seek damages. And those cases, actually, the issue of Frankovich damages, and they will be heard in November. There's 2 test cases that have been chosen, and I think it's set down for hearing in November. That's the issue of damages. But again, that takes you so far. Like, if people are still claiming asylum and are still homeless, it's, the problem still exists.
And are these families as well, or what?
No, I think generally speaking, it's single males, but there have been unaccompanied minors, and there have been women, I believe. But I think they say generally the majority who are denied accommodation are single males.
My goodness. Gosh. So those cases come up in the test cases in November. That'll be interesting. But again, the problem continues, and I guess it's up to the state to rectify that. And just as well, I remember back long ago when I did asylum law in Dublin, a big area was family reunification. Is that still what? Update us on that. I haven't looked into that in a long time. That was always a big one.
That's as soon as somebody gets status, they want to know, how can I get how can my family come to join me? So yeah, I mean, it's provided for in the Act. Section 56 of the International Protection Act provides for family reunification. So someone who has a grant of refugee status or subsidiary protection can apply for family reunification with the spouse who they married prior to making the application, or a child who's under the age of 18 and not married. And they've 12 months to do that. The difficulties that have arisen, I think, for me, is really from people from countries where Sharia law prevails when it comes to adopted children. So a child, I think the Supreme Court has interpreted a child under Section 56 it can be an adopted child. As far as I know, there's no interpretation of, what is an adopted child for the purposes of family reunification. And if you're from a country where Sharia law prevails, there is no full adoption. You can't have a full adoption certificate. So they have.
So it's not like a formal procedure through the courts or anything like that would be recognised.
It's just not allowed under Sharia law full adoption. So they have like certificates of responsibility.
I see.
Where they, and from countries, clients of mine from a place maybe like Somalia, that's, seen conflict for many, many years and humanitarian disaster really, they may have their own children and they may be caring for nieces and nephews whose parents are deceased through conflict. And it means when they come to apply for family reunification, that's pretty difficult.
I'd say so.
Yeah, so I think that's an area that's probably being litigated at the moment, just that area of the adopted child and what does it mean for the purposes of family reunification.
And recognising the family unit, perhaps, maybe going outside what we deem a family here and applying it to those particular cases. That's always seems to have been a bit of an issue, especially where children are concerned.
Yeah.
Even standard visa applications, I mean, when I was practicing, we find that extremely difficult. But to the client, their life is completely normal and it's standard that they would have, children. But again, you face the barriers then with the Home Office that you'd be dealing with, that this isn't a recognised family for B or C, whatever. So those cases always prove to be quite difficult. But hopefully there's some movement on that then going forward.
Yeah, I hope so. Just to make things a little bit easier for the clients concerned. Yeah.
So the numbers increase, and I know practitioners here feel the same in terms of people trying to access justice, particularly within asylum. It just seems to be an ongoing disaster with numbers. Do you think there's maybe, I suppose it's just outside the legal work, but maybe more of a hostile environment in Ireland, I guess, when it comes to asylum seekers? Just from the media, we can see different cohorts of society really coming out and speaking against asylum seekers. What has your kind of experience been on that, or does it impact your work in any way?
I think it does. I mean, especially when the issue of homelessness of asylum seekers, and it was kind of at the start of this year that began and was highlighted. And at the same time, they have, we have a housing crisis anyway. So when you put the two together, it just seemed to create this negative environment. And it was easy, I think, for people to pinpoint maybe migrants or asylum seekers as being the problem, as opposed to maybe the system or, the housing crisis itself and as being the problem. And unfortunately, I mean, even clients of mine who were living in tents outside the IPO office, faced these sort of protests, if you like, by people wanting them out. And,
wow.
And infiltrated, I think, by people not even from Ireland, stirring up trouble and very difficult. And I mean, it's sad as well, I think, for me as a practitioner, because prior to that and years gone by, clients would come in and be so happy to be in Ireland and so thankful that they got a Céad Míle Fáilte and a good welcome. And now it's totally changed. I think before they may have come from other countries in Europe and outside where they were treated very badly. And Ireland was totally different. But I think, that's changing. So I don't think that they have the same,
Céad Míle Fáilte.
Exactly, yeah. and they're not as happy to be here because things are not great, and that's sad.
It is sad. And I mean, when you think about the most, already vulnerable, potentially victims of survivors of torture, who are living on the street, and there's no end in sight until we finally see some resolution, which seems to be ongoing. I think the report I mentioned had referred to the past 5 months, escalating to a massive scale that they've never seen before. So this is a really big crisis, and you just think of the mental health of these people and their physical health as well. Like, what are they living off? How are they surviving? So that's really, really sad, and it's really detrimental that the state gets on top of this as soon as possible. So a different scene when it comes to asylum and I guess immigration law. It has an impact on that as well. But just one other area of immigration that I've always been interested in is naturalisation, and that was a big theme here in especially since Brexit. We had God, so many cases, a massive increase in people applying to become Irish. So naturalisation is normally where somebody maybe has, acquired their refugee status or, a requisite residence that they've been living lawfully in Ireland for a period of time, or where they have married an Irish spouse. So I've seen on the Department of Justice recently and seen people share some changes in policy and within the law. The new act that came in as well made some immigration changes in general. Are you hopeful that citizenship and the process of applying for Irish citizenship is going to become a little bit more streamlined? Because we have seen a lot of criticism in the past of huge delays, like ongoing delays, 4 or 5 years people are waiting. And just before we come on, I was mentioning to Siobhán, some of our cases were processed literally within 3 or 4 months. And that's despite having cases on my desk that were waiting 3-4 years, and other people come with cases that they just haven't received, much of a response to. There is a need for this to be improved, but how do you see things going forward, or what has your experience been with your clients?
I think, to be fair to the department, they've made efforts, in the last number of years to streamline the process, particularly with applications for naturalisation. I think at the start of 2022, they brought in a new scorecard approach. Where they scored, the document in order to provide, you had to get a score of 150 points to prove your residency for each year, and the same for identity. And again, in recent months, they provided new guidelines, which I think has streamlined it even more. So it's reduced the amount of documents again to just a type A and type B document for each year of residency. So essentially, if you can get that, it's 2 documents for each year. And you don't now have to provide every page of your current in-date passport certified by a solicitor, which is great for me because really, when that came in initially, it was wonderful for the client because they didn't have to send their original passport in. They could keep it.
Which is a big thing.
Which is a big thing, But for practitioners then realising they had
it took you an hour to certify. And then if they had any other passports as well, like if they had a set, you still had to certify their stamped pages. So it could take you literally an hour.
It's just, we were ordering ink by the new time on the stamp, So I think now it's just the biodata page and it's just 2 documents. If you can get that for each year, and for refugees they can provide an affidavit instead of the passport if they don't have it. So I think, in fairness, things are going in the right direction.
I think so.
And I think guidelines will be produced in respect of naturalisation by associations, which will be great, because I think that's one area. Where I think practitioners find it very difficult to advise clients because it's so unclear what's required.
So that is, again, just if you are, I suppose there's a list of kind of criteria that you can make an Irish citizenship application on, where you have an affinity or an association with somebody who's Irish. Now, I've seen applications made by clients themselves who come back to me and they would have said, I've been waiting, 2 or 3 years, and you see a copy of their application, and they would have made it on the basis that, their child was playing Gaelic football in Belfast and is learning Irish in school. And from their reading of, the limited information on the application, they felt that they had made a valid application. You kind of felt really bad for them because it is my experience that these are rarely, I've never seen one like that ever granted. Even cases where there would be a blood tie maybe to someone else who's Irish and not a direct family member, somebody who falls within the statutory definitions upon who you can make an application, like your spouse or whatever. So it's a very blurred grey area, but I have to say, I suppose working based in Northern Ireland on cases, that was something we'd be asked a lot on, where they fell outside the normal kind of criteria. People really wanted to know how they might get an Irish passport, plus they feel they're living on the island of Ireland, and association was something that came up a lot. And you're right, you couldn't advise on it. It was so difficult. So that would be very welcome to have some sort of guidance on that. Because I've never seen it. I've never come across a case where it was, and I think there was something in the High Court a couple of years ago as well, where there were sisters who applied, and I don't know whether it was I can't remember what the outcome was, but it has been challenged before, I think, that point on the criteria that the department used to establish whether the relationship is strong enough to warrant.
Yeah,
the
and the Immigration Service, the website does have, I suppose, a limited amount of guidance, and it speaks about reckonable residency in there for 3 years, and it speaks about, you know, exceptional circumstances where it's assent, you know, if you know, and the way it's worded, it kind of is saying, look, it's really only decent that they'll, you know, look at it, and if it's say a mother whose child is a citizen or siblings, there has to be, you know, nearly extraordinary circumstances where they're going. But yet nothing's clarified or explained as to, well, what exactly does that mean? What do we need to provide?
Interesting. But it's good to see some movement anyway. And you often hear there's talk of it going online, like the British system where you make your citizenship application online. I have to say I haven't done those. It's very, very straightforward. You know, compared, we're still sending massive bundles of paper to Tipperary when we're making the Irish citizenship applications. But a really interesting area, I think, and like the passport's one of the most popular in the world. It's ranked, I think, 4th or 5th in the index, so you check every so often. So a busy area of work, but it will be good to see that becoming a little bit more streamlined and a bit more efficient and user friendly, I think, for both practitioners and for clients. Just outside of immigration and the work that you're doing, we were chatting as well about a case, an interesting case. Isn't it the one in Manhattan? I think you had a resident, an Irish lady in Manhattan.
Yeah, Kathleen, a lovely, lovely lady. She got in touch with me. She's an Irish, she's now deceased. But an Irish lady who went to Manhattan, a single lady, went with her sister to Manhattan when she was, I think, in her 20s, and worked as a waitress there her entire life, and told me she invested well in stocks, which I found phenomenal, you know. I wouldn't know where to start, but she lived in the Upper West Side in a flat there, and her sister lived in a flat above her, and her sister had since died when she got in contact with me, but she two second cousins of hers from Ireland had got back in contact with her later on in her life, and she loaned them $300,000 to do various work in their house and other things. And when she sought to get the money back, they kind of disappeared. And, you know, she was 96 at this point and had a full-time carer in, but still living somewhat independently in her apartment. And I got a chance to go over and visit her. I was visiting a friend of mine who was an attorney at the time in New York, and I popped up to say hello to her. It just happened to all coincide. So again, we initiated proceedings in the High Court, and she gave her evidence by way of video link. Now, this was before COVID, so before video link was a thing,
right?
You know?
Okay, yeah.
So even for me, I was trying to figure out how is this going to work, you know? But yeah, like she just did so well. Like her neighbour downstairs brought her down, set up a laptop, and it was all, you know, and she gave her evidence. And I just remember just being so inspired. Like she's 96.
Wow.
She's on her own, you know. I think all her siblings at that point had predeceased her. And there she was in the High Court in Dublin, giving her evidence, you know. And it was a good day. So it settled. She didn't have to go into cross-examination, thankfully. And that was that. But it was just one of those things where, like, she clearly, although, you know, she very much had her wits about her and was very independent, but clearly quite a vulnerable person who had been taken advantage of, really. But that was a good day.
Very inspiring, and it's great when you do come across clients that just sit with you forever. Then, you know, you remember that case and that person, and you become really inspired by that, which I'm sure in your line of work and your colleagues as well who work in this area, you know, you come across that quite a lot, you know, and particularly because you're working on advancing matters for the most vulnerable in society. And just on that, I guess, this activist lawyer website or podcast, how, in your opinion, do you think, I suppose you've had that experience of working in corporate law environment, and now we can see where your passion is. It's in human rights law. How can we use the law? This is something we ask a lot of our guests effectively, I suppose, to advance matters and as a tool for activism.
Yeah, like I think I was talking earlier about the homeless situation, and, you know, I mean, we use the law to advance our clients' rights, you know, and with initiating proceedings on behalf of clients who are homeless, it I suppose put pressure on the state to sort the situation out, and those clients since were provided accommodation. But, you know, there's a bigger issue as well, you know, in winning, I suppose, the hearts and minds of people to welcome asylum seekers and migrants into their community, and maybe not be persuaded by these outside elements who are trying to promote the negative when it comes to migrants and asylum seekers. And it's up to us as well, I think, as practitioners, to be vocal about it and in support of the people we represent. Because, you know, we know them quite well, and any client who has ever come into my office who is an asylum seeker or migrant in a way, it's always, how can I get an employment permit? When can I start working? You know, when can I pay tax? When can I be a part of the community and contribute? No one's ever talking about social welfare or how I can get a free house or how I can get, you know, 100 quid a week or whatever the case may be. It's always, how can I get a permit and start working? And be an active member of the society and be able to give back. That's always the question. And I think maybe people who aren't aware of that can be very persuaded by these negative elements. So I think, it's sort of a twofold thing. It's like lawyers, we can, you know, do all the great high court work, but we also have to advocate for our clients as well and be vocal maybe in support of them. And then it's up to society really and the state. Yeah,
and you get that first-hand kind of insight into what's really happening. So just, I suppose, for listeners, and you've had a really interesting transition into human rights law, and I think you made a leap of faith, I guess, and followed your passion, and you decided that's what you wanted to work in. For anyone listening who might be interested in either getting into human rights law from the outset, or maybe transitioning over from corporate law or commercial law into human rights, what advice might you have for them, Siobhán?
I suppose if you've time, maybe you know, get in contact with an NGO or volunteer, or just get an idea of the kind of work, that kind of practical experience. I mean, you know, what I did as well was I went back and sort of retrained. I did a master's, you know, doing some sort of study in the area would help as well. But I think just that on the ground practical experience. I mean, even I know you mentioned Specialising earlier. They're a wonderful organisation that provide services, rehabilitation to survivors of torture. And they have a befriending programme where you can become a befriender, and essentially you're a friend to an asylum seeker who's getting services from Specialising. And it's a great way to just get to know the people that I've been talking about, I suppose, for the
and the
past
challenges
while.
that they face.
Exactly. And it's you're helping them just, you know, texting or whatever, and basic stuff.
Important to them,
But it's a good way to sort of get a feel for the clients that ultimately, if you do want to get into this area, that you'll be working with. And I would highly recommend it to anyone who's thinking about it. I mean, for me, although the work is challenging, I love coming into the office every morning, and I didn't have that with corporate law. You know, I love getting up, I love coming in. There's lots of challenges. It can be manic at times, but it's enjoyable and really rewarding. You do feel like you've achieved something at the end of the day.
Brilliant. Well, Siobhán Conlon, thank you so much for joining me today. That's so insightful. And if anybody wants to find out more about Siobhán's work, you've got your website up and running, and I'll share a link to that on our podcast text. Thank you so much.
Thanks a million, Sarah.
Thanks everyone for joining me today. If you like the show, please remember to share and leave a review if you have a moment. And you can also check out our website, www.activistlawyer.com, where you will see some blog articles written by our guests and contributors, as well as some fabulous Activist Lawyer merchandise.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service. for our team using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.